Hello and welcome. I'm Yuki. There's a feeling that seems to arrive for everyone at some point. You look up and it's suddenly autumn again. The year is nearly gone and you couldn't really say where it went. And each year seems to go a little faster than the one before it. Most of us explain that away in one of two ways. We say we're too busy, or we say it's just what getting older does. I don't think either of those is quite it. Where I grew up in Japan, the years didn't feel like that, and it took me a long time to understand why. It isn't that people there have more time, they have exactly the same number of days. So instead of asking how to get more time, I'd like to ask you something different today. How many days from this past year could you actually tell apart? Because I think that's the real answer. A year doesn't feel short because it was busy. It feels short because nothing in it was marked. Let me show you what I mean and what an ordinary Japanese home does about it. Let's begin. I want to start with one small corner of a room because everything else comes back to it. In a traditional Japanese house, there's a shallow alcove built into the wall. We call it the tokonoma. There isn't much in it: a hanging scroll and a single flower in a vase, sometimes a small bowl or a stone. That's all. But here's the part that matters. What's in it changes with the season. A branch of plum blossom in late winter, an iris in early summer, a stem of pampas grass in autumn. Somebody in the house changes it by hand when the season turns. And so the room itself quietly tells you where you are in the year. I'd like you to hold on to that alcove because that's what this whole video is really about. Not filling your time, marking it. The same thing happens on the table, and it happens every single week. Food here follows the seasons closely, and there's a word for it: shun, meaning the moment when something is at its best. You eat bamboo shoots in spring because that's when they're good. Cold noodles in the heat of summer. Chestnuts and mushrooms in autumn. A particular fish when it's in season, and then not again for a year. Nobody is being fancy about it. It's simply the cheapest and the best way to eat. But look at what it does to a year. If January tastes different from June, and June tastes different from October, then you have 12 months you can tell apart, not from a calendar, but from your own mouth. My grandmother would announce the first bamboo shoots every spring as though they were a visitor arriving. And because she did that, I still know exactly what April tasted like in her kitchen. Japan takes this further than most people realize, and this is the part that surprised me when I first learned it properly. The year here isn't divided into 4 seasons. Traditionally, it's divided into 24. They're called seki, and each one covers about 2 weeks, and each one has a name. There's a period called the waking of insects in early spring, one called small heat, and one called great heat in the middle of summer, one called the descent of frost in late autumn. Older calendars break those 24 down further still, into around 72 tiny seasons of a few days each. Now, most people today couldn't name them all, and I certainly can't. But the idea behind them soaks into ordinary life anyway. The year isn't one long stretch with 4 vague corners. It's a chain of small, named, noticeable changes. And a year made of 72 small pieces is a very hard year to lose track of. It isn't only the alcove that changes either. The whole house changes its clothes through the year. When summer comes, out come the reed screens that hang over the windows to filter the light, and the thin rush mats, and often a small glass wind chime under the eaves. The heavy things get put away. Then in autumn, they all come back. And by winter, there's a low table with a heated quilt around it, the kotatsu, that the whole family puts their legs under. So the room you sit in doesn't just look different in July and January. It sounds different because of the chime. It feels different under your hands. And swapping those things over is a small job somebody has to do, twice a year, which means the change gets noticed rather than sliding past. A house that never changes is a house where every month feels the same. Ours announced summer to me before the weather did. Quick pause. My ebook, The Quiet Reset, gives you simple rituals for making time feel less blurred at home. It's the first link in the description. And speaking of seasonal signals, there's an even more literal version of this, and it made me laugh when I first thought about it properly. Clothes here traditionally change on a date. It's called koromogai. Schools and many workplaces switch from winter to summer uniforms around the start of June, and back again around October. It's a formality, and people grumble about it when the weather doesn't cooperate. But it does mean that twice a year, an entire country stops and acknowledges that the season has turned. You can't drift past that. It's written into what you put on in the morning. You even hear it in how people write to each other. Letters and cards here traditionally open with a line about the season. The plums are out, the rains have come, the evenings are getting cool. It's a small formality, and it can be almost automatic. But it means that before you say anything at all to another person, you first have to notice where you are in the year and put it into words. Do that a few times a month, for a lifetime, and you simply don't drift through a year unaware. I only understood this after I stopped doing it. Living abroad, my messages became pure business: arrangements, questions, replies. Nothing in them ever mentioned that it had started to rain. Then there's the habit that Japan is best known for, and it's worth looking at properly. Every spring, when the cherry trees bloom, people go and sit under them. We call it hanami, flower viewing. Whole families take food and sit on the ground in the park, sometimes for a whole afternoon. Offices go together after work, and the reason it matters is the timing. The blossom lasts about a week, maybe two if the weather is kind. It arrives, it's beautiful, and then a bit of wind takes it and it's over. Everyone knows this, and that's precisely why they go. Nobody says they'll catch it next month, because there is no next month for it. A thing that will only be here for 10 days gets your attention in a way that something permanent never does. And here's what I noticed later, living somewhere without it. I could tell you which spring I saw a particular blossom 20 years ago. I couldn't tell you a single thing about the spring before last. So let me stop and say plainly what all of this is doing, because I think it's the whole answer. Your memory doesn't keep hours, it keeps differences. When something happens that isn't like the days around it, your mind files it away. When a day is more or less identical to the 50 days before it, there's nothing to file, so nothing gets kept. And here's the uncomfortable part. A year isn't judged as it happens, it's judged afterwards, from what you can remember of it. So a year of identical days can be perfectly full, busy, tiring, hard work, and still feel, in December, like almost nothing happened. That's not a failure of your memory. That's a year with no marks on it, which is why being busier doesn't help at all. Busy days can be just as identical as empty ones. What slows a year down isn't doing more, it's noticing more and marking it when you do. There's a small proof of this that most people have lived through. Think of a week you spent somewhere new. A trip, a first week in a job, a holiday as a child. It probably felt enormous, and you can still describe it in detail years later. Meanwhile, last February, which was also 4 weeks, has almost nothing in it. Nothing about the trip was longer. It was just made of days you'd never had before, so every one of them got kept. You can't be somewhere new every week, of course, but you can make an ordinary week hold one thing that the week before didn't. That is a much smaller ask, and it does the same job. There's a phrase people use here that says it in 4 words. Ichigo ichie. It means roughly one time, one meeting. The idea comes from tea gatherings, and it's simply this. This particular meeting with these people in this weather will never happen again in exactly this form. Even if you all meet again next week, that will be a different gathering. It sounds obvious when you say it out loud. Living as though it's true is another thing entirely. But when you treat an ordinary afternoon as something that happens once, you actually look at it. And an afternoon you looked at is an afternoon you'll still have in 10 years. I try to think of it now when I'm with people I don't see often, that this exact version of today isn't repeating. Underneath a great deal of this is a way of feeling about time that has its own name here. Mono no aware. It means something like a gentle awareness that things don't last. I want to be careful with it, because in English it can sound heavier and sadder than it actually is. It isn't gloom. It's closer to what you feel watching the last warm evening of summer, when you know there won't be many more. And that makes you sit outside a bit longer instead of going in. That's the whole of it. Knowing a thing will end is what makes you look at it. The blossom is loved because it falls. The evening is precious because it gets cold. My grandmother used to say the plum blossom was better than the cherry because fewer people bothered to go and see it. I understood what she meant much later. She wasn't talking about flowers at all. Some of these markers are made deliberately out of nothing much, and I love this about Japanese life. In autumn, People go outside to look at the moon. That's the entire event. It's called tsukimi. You make a particular kind of dumpling. You put out a few stems of grass and you look up. It costs nothing. Nothing happens. And yet it becomes a specific evening that you remember, in a way that 100 ordinary evenings of exactly the same weather do not. This is worth sitting with because it's the cheapest version of everything I've said. You don't need a holiday or an event to make a day distinct. You need a reason to stop and look at something, and then the willingness to actually do it. Even if the thing you look at is just the moon, which was going to be there anyway. Then there are the big anchors, the ones that come round once a year. New Year here is the largest by far. Particular foods, prepared in advance and eaten from special boxes. The house cleaned from top to bottom before the year turns. Cards sent to everyone you know. These repeat exactly every single year, and that's their power. Because you've done the same thing before, you can feel the distance between this time and last time. You remember who was at the table last year and isn't now. You notice that the children can suddenly reach the counter. A repeated ritual is how you measure a year, in the way a mark on a door frame measures a child. Without a few of those, one year slides into another with nothing to separate them. My family made the same New Year food every year of my childhood, and I can line those years up in my head like photographs because of it. And it doesn't have to be New Year or anything traditional at all. It only has to be the same, and annual, and something you actually do. One particular meal, one walk you take on the same weekend every year. The point isn't the ritual. It's having a fixed thing to stand next to, so you can see how far you've come since the last one. There's a smaller version of the same thing, and it happens all year round. People here make a small occasion out of the first of anything. The first sound of the cicadas, the first bonito of the season, the first snow. The word for it just means first, hatsu, and it gets attached to all sorts of ordinary things. It's a tiny bit of attention paid to something that only becomes the first once. And it turns a passive year, where things simply happen around you, into a year where you keep catching things as they arrive. I still notice every single year the first evening that's warm enough to have the window open. That one small thing tells me where I am. I do have to be honest with you here, because I'd be selling you a fantasy otherwise. Modern Japan is not a slow place. Tokyo moves as fast as any city on Earth. People work long hours, stare at the same phones, and lose whole months to work exactly like everyone else. Nobody should imagine that the whole country is sitting quietly under a cherry tree. These habits are not proof that we've solved it. They're a counterweight, the ordinary things that survive inside a fast life and quietly keep it from turning into a blur. And I think that's the more useful way to see them. Not a slower country, just a set of small marks that a fast year can still be measured by. So let me put it simply. The things that make a year vanish are these: days that look like each other, meals that could be any month, no reason to look up, and nothing repeated closely enough to compare. And the things that slow a year down are ordinary and cheap. Food that belongs to the month you're in. Something in the room that changes when the season does. One brief thing you go out and see because it won't be there in 2 weeks. A small occasion made out of nothing. The moon, an open window, the first of something. One meal a year cooked exactly the same way. And treating an ordinary afternoon as if it only happens once, which happens to be true. If you take one thing from this, take a question instead of a habit. What will you remember from this month? If the honest answer is nothing, that isn't because your month was empty. It's because nothing in it was marked. And that's fixable this week. Which brings me back to that alcove. One flower, changed when the season turns. Nobody in Japan would call that a way of slowing down time. It's just how the room is kept. But someone has to notice that the plum is out in order to go and cut it. And that noticing, repeated through a year, is the closest thing to more time that I know of. You don't need an alcove. Put one thing somewhere you'll see it, and change it when the weather does. Then notice, in December, whether the year felt a little longer. If you want more quiet ways to notice your days before they disappear, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time.